There is a place on this planet that holds the largest reserves of fresh water, some of the deepest underwater channels, and resources measured in trillions. A place no country officially owns, yet 12 of them sit at the table, deciding who gets in, what can be done, and what can be known. We call it Antarctica. But the question isn't what it is. The question is, who really holds it? Antarctica is the 5th largest continent on Earth. Larger than Europe. Larger than Australia. Almost twice the size of the United States. And yet almost no one lives there. Not because it's impossible. Because it's been decided that way. The continent sits at the bottom of the world, locked under an ice sheet that in some places reaches 4 kilometers deep. Beneath that ice, liquid lakes. Rivers. A geological world that hasn't seen sunlight in millions of years. Scientists have found over 400 subglacial lakes down there, the largest of which, Lake Vostok, is roughly the size of Lake Ontario. But ice isn't the only thing Antarctica is hiding. The continent holds an estimated 1 trillion tons of iron ore. Coal deposits that stretch across mountain ranges no one has fully mapped. Rare earth elements that the modern tech industry would pay almost anything to access. And beneath the ice shelf, offshore oil and gas reserves that some estimates place in the hundreds of billions of barrels. None of that can be touched. Not legally. Not yet. There are no cities here. No permanent civilian population. The only people allowed on the continent are scientists and the military personnel that quietly accompany them. At any given time, roughly 1,000 people spend the winter there. In summer, that number climbs to around 5,000. 5,000 people. On a continent the size of a small planet. Everything that happens there is monitored. Every visit is logged. Every researcher needs approval. And the ice just keeps its secrets. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959. 12 countries put their names on it: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, Australia, France, Norway, New Zealand, Belgium, Japan, South Africa, Chile, and Argentina. On paper, it looks like cooperation. A gentleman's agreement to keep Antarctica peaceful, to dedicate it to science, to freeze all territorial claims and ban military activity anywhere on the continent. But this was 1959. The Cold War was running at full temperature. These two countries couldn't agree on anything, and yet here they were, signing the same document, walking away satisfied. Something made that easy. A few years earlier, in 1946, the United States launched Operation Highjump. Admiral Richard Byrd led it, 13 ships, 33 aircraft, close to 5,000 men. The stated mission was scientific research. Mapping. Weather stations. Standard post-war exploration. Except the military doesn't deploy a naval carrier group to take ice samples. That's not how it works. Highjump had the structure and the scale of something else entirely: a reconnaissance operation, or something closer to a search. It ended ahead of schedule. Byrd came back, gave a brief press statement, and didn't say much publicly after that. What's interesting is where a lot of that early mapping effort was concentrated: a stretch of the continent that German expeditions had surveyed just years before the war. They called it Neuschwabenland. They'd flown over it, photographed it, dropped markers to claim it. The question isn't why Germany was interested in Antarctica in the late 1930s. The question is what they found there that was worth mapping carefully enough to come back for. Germany's interest in Antarctica didn't start after the war. It started before it. In 1938, the Third Reich launched an expedition to a section of the continent they would claim as their own. They called it Neuschwabenland, New Swabia. German aircraft flew over the territory in a systematic grid, dropping metal swastika markers into the ice every 30 kilometers to establish presence. They weren't exploring. They were staking. What they were looking for, officially, was a source of whale oil for margarine production. Germany needed fat reserves. That was the explanation given at the time, and most historians have left it there. But the expedition was organized and overseen by the Reich Aviation Ministry. Hermann Göring signed off on it personally. The planning was meticulous, the investment significant, and the timing, less than a year before the invasion of Poland, was not the moment a country on the edge of war sends resources to the bottom of the world for cooking fat. Something was considered worth finding. After the war, the claims get stranger. Former SS officers testified that submarine supply routes had been established to Antarctica during the final years of the conflict. U-boats that never surrendered. Cargo that was never accounted for. A network of tunnels beneath the ice, allegedly built using forced labor, leading to a base the Reich had been quietly constructing since the early 1940s. None of this has been verified. The testimonies exist mostly in post-war intelligence files, some declassified, many still restricted. But the Americans knew enough about it to send Admiral Richard Byrd back to Antarctica in 1946 with the largest military force the continent had ever seen. After the war ended, something unusual happened. The Allies had defeated Germany. The Reich was gone, its leadership dead or on trial, its military dismantled. The victors divided the country, took its scientists, catalogued its secrets. But in the months that followed, and in the years after that, a significant number of senior SS officers, scientists, and military figures disappeared. Not captured. Not killed. Gone. Some turned up in South America. Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay. Juan Perón's government in Buenos Aires was particularly accommodating. Networks were established, what historians now call ratlins, routes that moved people, money, and documents out of Europe and into the southern hemisphere. The Vatican was involved. Spanish and Portuguese intermediaries. False papers issued through organizations that should have had no interest in protecting war criminals. This part is documented. This isn't speculation, the ratlins are in the historical record, confirmed by post-war investigations, declassified intelligence files, and decades of research by war crimes prosecutors. What's less documented is where some of those routes ended. Not Buenos Aires. Not Sao Paulo. Further south. Some of the files that came out of post-war intelligence, American, British, Soviet, contain references to ongoing German activity in the Antarctic region. Supply runs. Submarine sightings in southern waters as late as 1946. A small number of U-boats that surrendered not to Allied forces in Europe, but showed up in Argentine ports months after the German surrender, crew intact, cargo unspecified. Two of those submarines, U-530 and U-977, have never had their final cargo fully accounted for. The commanders were interrogated. They gave partial answers. What they were carrying, and why they were still running 9 months after Germany collapsed, was never conclusively established. That's not a conspiracy. That's an open file. So here's where we are. A continent with no owner, protected by a treaty that shouldn't have been easy to sign. A naval expedition that left early and explained nothing. A German territorial claim that was staked before the war and never formally abandoned. And several hundred people who helped run that war, who knew its deepest programs, its most classified research, who simply walked out of Europe and vanished south. None of that proves anything. That's important to say. But the question isn't whether there's a secret base under the ice. The question is simpler than that. It's, why does this continent, specifically, make powerful governments behave so carefully? Why does the treaty hold when almost nothing else from that era has? Why do the claims get frozen but never dropped? Antarctica is the most isolated place on Earth. It has no indigenous population, no economy, no strategic value that's ever been publicly explained. And yet 12 countries, including 2 that were actively trying to destroy each other, agreed to leave it alone. Maybe that's exactly what it looks like. An unusual moment of cooperation in an unusual time. Or maybe the agreement wasn't about keeping people out. Maybe it was about keeping something quiet.